very exciting findings in neuroscience in the past 75 years, and one of those important scientific findings is the discovery of a dedicated pleasure circuit in our brain called the reward pathway, as well as the discovery of dopamine as a human brain neurotransmitter. Now, dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter involved in the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation, but it is the final common pathway for all reinforcing substances and behaviors. The more reinforcing something is, the more dopamine it releases in the pleasure or reward pathway, and the faster that dopamine is released. This slide represents a conglomeration of many different studies done over the years, showing how rodents respond to different types of rewards. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. What we see is that with the initial exposure to a high dopamine reward, we get a huge increase in dopamine, followed by precipitous fall in dopamine levels, not just to baseline, but actually below baseline to that dopamine deficit state. That's that moment of craving. That can happen even while we're eating the piece of chocolate, right? We're already thinking about the next one. But if we resist, those gremlins hop off, and dopamine levels go back up to our baseline level position. But if we continue to ingest, what we find is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar reinforcing stimulus, that initial spike upwards gets shorter and weaker, but that after response gets stronger and longer, and eventually we can end up in a chronic dopamine deficit state. That is addiction. What we find in clinical care is that on average, it takes about 4 weeks after we've stopped using our drug of choice, whether it's heroin or meth or TikTok or chocolate or, in my case, romance novels. Twilight was my gateway drug. Anyone else in here? Before we can restore those baseline levels of firing. Here's what happens when we anticipate a certain reward and it doesn't come. That dopamine level goes way below baseline, right? We all know that a reward that you were expecting that doesn't come is much worse than a reward you were never expecting at all. So that speaks to some of our more modern digital drugs where we go on, our kids post something online, they get a ton of likes. The next time they do it, they don't get any likes, or maybe they get a bunch of hate. They're just not in neutral. They're going in a dopamine deficit state. For somebody who's vulnerable to addiction to that particular drug, that will drive them to do more work to get the levels up. It won't encourage them to stop doing that behavior.